Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this Swisher Trim-N-Mow. I was on the way home the other day and I passed this machine at the end of someone's driveway. It looked like they were hoping for someone to take it away, so I turned around and thankfully they pulled in their driveway right when I was pulling up. So I was able to confirm that indeed they were hoping that this would disappear. So I shoved it in the back of the car, didn't really ask too many questions, but I did pull it over. And the engine pulled over fine. It has compression, so in theory, this should run again. Of course, from looking at it, I can tell this machine has been neglected. It is pretty rusty and crusty. So before trying to start this, I'm actually going to fire up the pressure washer. We're going to get some of the dirt off, and then we'll bring it inside. We'll see what it needs, and with any luck, get it up and running again. Cleaned up pretty well, although the paint is not in great shape. It is bubbling pretty much everywhere. So I would say this has been outside for quite a while, and in fact the pressure washer took a bunch of paint off right there. Anyway, I think it goes without saying that this likely doesn't run, which is why it was pushed to the curb. So almost guaranteed we're going to have to pull that carb and clean it. I did take a look in the tank, and it is mostly empty. There is a little bit of fuel, old fuel down there. It smells pretty bad, so likely the carb is not going to run the engine at all. But I say we give it the benefit of the doubt. We'll add a little bit of fresh fuel, pull it over, and see if it shows any signs of life. Of course, before we do that, let's just take a look at the air filter, check the oil, and if all looks good, we'll try to start it. There is some in there. It looks like it might be a little low. And yeah, it's in the safe zone, but just barely. So we are going to have to add some. I'm going to change it anyway. But let's hear the engine run first before we change that oil. And let's take a look at the air filter. That was kind of loose, so I think someone's been in here. And actually, I can tell someone's been in here because we're missing hardware right there. And I noticed we also have this clip up on the starter recoil rope. I think that goes behind here somewhere, so I'm just going to set that aside. We'll deal with that later. And the air filter, not in very good shape. That might be original to the machine. So I'm going to set that aside for now, and we'll come back to that later. All right, I'm going to turn the choke on. This also has a primer, so I'll prime it a few times. Let's try it out. All right, let's give this a try. The choke is on. I pumped the primer about 3 times, so it should do something. And we get nothing. So I'm going to try a bit of starting fluid. You know, if it kicks off, then we know we have spark and compression. Well, that 2 seconds of runtime told me quite a bit. We know for sure we have compression, spark, and timing. Fuel is the issue. So without a doubt, that carburetor has to come off and get cleaned up. But there were 2 other hints of possible problems as well. You know, first off, when the engine was starting and also shutting down, I heard what kind of sounded like a knock. You know, I'm kind of optimistic that maybe it was something else rattling. You know, I guess we're not going to know for sure until we get the engine running a little bit longer. And the other issue I noticed was a bunch of debris flying out from under the blower housing. So I think we should just get the carb off, the tank off, the blower housing off. We'll clean everything up, put it back together, and go from there. All right, the tank is technically free except for the fuel line. So let's go after the carb next, and we'll circle back to the tank. Before we get this carb off, let's clamp off the fuel line and remove it from the carb while it's still secured. I'm actually going to replace this fuel line, I think, so we will just cut it off. Looks like we're almost free. There is a tin here that kind of folds under, but it looks like we should be able to push it off. Oh yeah, we've got a mouse house. Yeah, Mickey made quite a mess in here. Surprisingly, though, the wires are intact. You know, I don't see any missing insulation, so I think we got pretty lucky on that one. You know, the blower housing, complete mess. Tank, kind of a mess as well. And the carb, I'm sure it's a mess, but that one is not Mickey's fault. So let's get that opened and see if we can save it. All right, let's start by getting this fuel line off, which easier said than done. Let's cut that off. Oh yeah. That's the good stuff. That is pretty dark. It almost looks like two-stroke. Not sure it is, though. Although if it is two-stroke, that oil would preserve the carburetor. So let's hope that that's what it was. And yeah, look at that. So I'm thinking that was two-stroke fuel because the inside of this carburetor looks to be in fantastic shape. You know, the bowl is almost spotless. Needle and float look good. And that's more or less it. I mean, we have an emulsion tube right there. It's not removable. We have a replaceable rubber seat right there. So I'm going to have to be careful putting this through the ultrasonic because that can damage the neoprene. So I'm going to try to get the bowl gasket out. This seat is going to have to stay where it is. If it becomes damaged, then we'll replace it. And these ports here, at least the one on the left, does look to be clogged. And we also have an O-ring right here, which we can remove. So yeah, this actually is going to clean up really well. And just one thing to note, the primer, in order to work, I think it does need a good seal on the bowl. And also the airbox needs a good seal to the carburetor. So we'll test the primer. If it doesn't work, we may need some new gaskets and seals. That's it. Nothing else comes out of the carb. This here is the main jet. Let me shine a light through there, see if it's clogged. Not sure how well that shows up on camera, but the main jet does not appear to be clogged. So this carburetor actually had potential to run the engine, if that stuff wasn't in the bowl. So yeah, let's give this a quick soak. I actually think I'm just going to use some dish detergent because this is not that bad and I don't want to damage that seat. And that's actually not drilled out, so that was not clogged like I thought it was. And we have a little passage right here, which seems to be free. Carb cleaned up pretty well. So I would say there's a pretty good chance that this is going to run the engine properly. So let's get it back together. Starting with the bowl gasket, and then we'll do the needle and float. And lastly, the main jet. Not a whole lot to this carb. Okay, I'm going to set this aside for now. Let's clean up the tank, and then we can get this back together. I've already knocked off all the heavy dirt on this blower housing. It's going to need to be painted, but I'm not going to do that yet. We still need to hear the engine run. I'm pretty sure it's going to be fine, but I don't want to paint this all up real nice just to find out that the engine isn't usable. Going to put a little bit of fluid film on some of the parts down here. You know, like the governor arm, it got a bit rusty. I think that was mouse central. And then right here as well. I mean, I don't want to get any on the brake, but I think putting a little bit of fluid film on some of the metal down here is going to do nothing but help. Yeah, I'm noticing the governor linkage, it is bound up. Right now we're stuck at full throttle. So that governor arm, you know, that's where I found the dead mouse right underneath. And of course that arm is all rusted up. So we're actually, I think, bound up. So if I were to start it right now, the engine would just run at wide open throttle. So let's get this cover back off, see if we can't free that up. I think that's the problem area right there. So the governor arm comes over, connects to that shaft and goes down into the engine. And you can see there's a bunch of junk kind of between that governor arm and the engine block. And I'm willing to bet if I clean that out, things should start moving again. Kind of like going to the dentist. Got to get all the plaque off. You know, worst case too, this arm is really kind of far down on the shaft, so we could, well, theoretically loosen up this bolt and slide this arm up a bit to get more clearance between the arm and the block. Let's see if it's moving yet. Nope. It is not budging. Yeah, that is really tight. There's no way the governor is going to be able to control that throttle. So I'm thinking we need to remove the governor arm and actually get this moving better, or at least move the governor arm up a little bit. Because right now it's just right against the block, and that is not helping anything. That made quite a difference. So I'm kind of confused as far as what happened here. Was it the mouse? Or was the governor arm just driven down to the point where it couldn't move because it was hitting the block? Because now that it's up, it functions perfectly. So, I might bring that up a little bit more, loosen this up a little bit more. We'll just do a governor reset, and I think we'll be good. All right, so we're pretty loose on that shaft. So what we want to do here is find idle and wide open throttle. In this case, idle is when you turn the shaft clockwise, and wide open throttle is counterclockwise. So right now, the spring is holding this arm in the wide open throttle position. So all we need to do is rotate the shaft counterclockwise until it stops. And then we just lock down, and the calibration's complete. You know what? That shaft is completely frozen. So the only reason this is moving now is because I loosened up this nut. The shaft, not moving at all. So I think we need to get the whole arm off and work at this a bit more. All right. I kind of have a bad feeling about this. Like we might end up taking the whole engine apart to fix this, but hopefully we can free it up. So this is just a bit of PB Blaster. I'm going to try this a few times and then likely hit it with some heat. See if we can't get some movement out of it. Pretty sure there's a plastic seal there, so applying heat may not be the best idea, but I'm hoping if I heat up the shaft, maybe it'll start spinning. I wouldn't say it's moving freely, but at least it's moving. So we'll do this for a few minutes. I'm sure it'll work itself out. Yeah, I think I see the issue here. I thought this might be a plastic seal, but I think it's a spacer. I think it's a washer. And that, I'm pretty sure, is what is creating the problem here. Anyway, you get the idea. You know, it's moving, but to be honest, it requires a ton of force. And it's getting a little better, but as it is right now, there's no way this is going to work. But let me keep working on it. I can't really make it worse. Can only make it better. You know, although this shaft is moving, it is not moving freely. And there's no way that that's going to control the engine speed. So to save this engine, I think we are going to have to open it up and remove the governor and clean it up to have any chance of that working. Of course, I really don't want to do that yet because I don't know 100% if this is a good engine. So what I'm thinking is we should just remove the governor rod, remove the governor spring, which is holding this in the wide open throttle position, and then maybe relocate the spring to hold it in the idle position. The issue is this doesn't have an idle set screw. So if we just hold it right up in the idle position, that's actually fully closing the throttle plate, and it's not going to run like that. So there is a casting, there is a hole. It's not threaded, but I think we can tap some threads on it. I have this other Briggs carb. It's not the right size for this engine, but it does have the set screw. And I'm willing to bet we could just transfer that over to there once we get some threads on there. I really thought we were going to hear this run properly tonight. And then the biggest problem was going to be fixing the paint. But I'm not too worried about the paint anymore. We have much bigger issues. I couldn't find the right size tap for the screw that was on that other carburetor, so instead, just going with what I have, which I think will be fine for testing, because that is not going to stay in there, this idle set screw. All right, we'll start like that. Don't want to open it too much. We'll get it started and then make some adjustments. All right, I got the blower housing back on. The throttle is in the idle position. Might be too slow. Might be too fast. So we'll try starting it. If it starts, we'll try to adjust it while it's running. But we might have to shut it down to make the actual adjustments. I'm just realizing too, I'm wrong about this. I assumed it was a choke and that we also had a primer on the airbox. And this piece here actually seems to do, well, I guess nothing because the spring is gone. So this is actually a throttle control. Interesting. Anyway, since we don't have a choke or a primer, we'll just help it out a little bit. So what do you think? Is it going to knock? Is the engine going to race out of control? Is it going to start at all? I think it'll start. Maybe. Nice. Yeah, what can I say? The engine runs and it actually sounds good. That noise I thought was knocking was just the machine rattling. The actual engine sounds great. The carburetor is running the engine quite well. Really, the biggest issue here is the governor. So I think we're going to have to order a new one because that shaft, it is obviously severely rusted and pitted, but I also mushroomed it a bit. So I don't want to pull that shaft out of the block and mess up the block. So likely we're going to have to cut the shaft off and just pull out the remains. So before I order anything for this engine, I think kind of the big thing here left to check is the pulley. You know, to get the engine opened up, we need to get the pulley off. And I'm sure that pulley is quite rusty like the rest of this machine. So let's actually get the oil out. We'll get the engine uninstalled, flip it over, and see if we can't get that pulley off. So what do you think? Nope. I'm going to try a puller. Usually don't use them on pulleys because the pulleys bend quite easily, but the bottom part of this pulley is actually some pretty thick material. So I think I can apply some pressure before I need to worry about causing any damage. Yeah, it's coming off. Beautiful. The parts, they've been ordered. They'll be here in a few days. I got a Sten's oil seal from Amazon as well as a Sten's gasket. And I actually went to eBay to find the governor shaft. It is used, but for $9 I get a used governor shaft that looks to be in good condition. And more importantly, it also comes with a governor arm and a bolt and nut. So all that stuff will be replaced, which is probably a good thing because that stuff is rusted pretty bad. So while we wait for those parts to arrive, I'm going to bring this back outside. I'm going to spray a bunch of degreaser on it, rinse it off, and then bring it back in. I want to get the engine opened up, get that old governor shaft out, and then just prep this as much as possible for reassembly. I'm also going to take the coil off. I don't think the water will hurt it, but I don't want to risk it either. Before I get this engine block opened up, I'm going to cut off the shaft, at least the damaged part, for the governor system. I'm going to sand off the burr, oil it a bit with some penetrating oil, and then we'll flip it over, get the cover off, and see if we can't uninstall that governor shaft. There we go. Okay, and we are in. So the component we're interested in is this paddle right here. This is right against the governor, and this also doubles as the oil slinger. As this rotates, it dips down into the sump where the oil is, and it picks up oil and just splashes it all around. So this kind of serves two purposes. So we'll move that out of the way for now. Everything looks to be really good in here, as I would expect. This engine hasn't suffered any trauma. We do have the plastic cam gear, or at least the gear is. The shaft is metal, but the lobes are plastic, so this is another point of failure. I actually did a video on that some time ago. And ideally, this would just come right out. There shouldn't be anything holding it in place, but it is stuck solid. So I'm going to apply some heat, and we'll just use the pliers to hopefully wiggle that out. Yeah, this one's going to be a bit of work. got it. Yeah, I thought that was oil on there at first, but that is corrosion. Goes down the length to the washer. So it doesn't look like much. I mean, that could be cleaned up. But I've already cut it short. And for $9, we have one that looks to be in perfect condition. So we'll just wait a few days for that to show up. You know, for now, I'm going to clean out the bore and just get this old gasket material removed. I took a second, just cleaned up the bore, and also cleaned some of the rust scale off this governor shaft. Now, although I don't plan on using it, it's still good to use just as a test that things are going to work out with the new used part that's on its way. And you can see that governor shaft moves freely like it should. So yeah, it didn't take much. I mean, there wasn't a lot of scale there, so the tolerances there are very tight. And any rust, well, it's going to be an issue, but it's not anymore. So let's clean this surface up, and then I think the block will be ready. Just rotating this engine to top dead center, which will be when that mark on the gear aligns with that mark on the camshaft. So I'm going to get the camshaft out just to make it a lot easier to clean things up, and that way if I drop anything in, it's not going to be all over the cam. And when I pull this out, the lifters might fall out, although it looks like they're in there pretty good, so we'll just leave them there. And we have 2 dowel pins. Let's get those out of the way, and we'll use a sharp new razor to clean this up. Or we'll just leave them. I just took a second and put this engine cover back on because I want to keep the dust out from inside the engine. What I plan on doing next is sanding and refinishing a few parts on this machine. So, I'm going to start with the blower housing. We'll just knock some of this rust down, get some primer and fresh paint on it. And then I want to do the same over here. This is pretty bad. And really, I'm not trying to make it look perfect, but I definitely can improve on its looks. And more importantly, getting some fresh paint on there should dramatically slow down what's happening with the rust. It's the next day, and the parts, they are nice and dry. Overall, I'm pretty happy with the way they turned out. If you don't look too close, you would never know how bad a shape they were in. Anyway, I think it is time to get everything back together. The parts I was waiting on have arrived. We've got the governor shaft, the governor arm, some of the hardware to install the governor. So I'm going to start there. And then we have the new oil seal and the crankcase gasket. So this stuff should get the engine fixed. And once that is done, we will just get the rest of the machine together and try it out. Just going to get the governor out of the way. Actually, before I do that, though, let's get the paddle in. And it's kind of a tight fit. Yeah, it looks like the shaft, it's marked up a little bit. So we're going to make that smooth before this is going to install properly. Feels pretty good. Let's try that. Yep. That feels a lot better. So I'm going to move over this washer, which goes on the inside of the engine. It goes all the way down until it hits kind of this area on the shaft that is pinched, so it can't go down anymore. So I'm going to add a little bit of oil to the shaft. We'll drop it in. And then on the other side, we have this lock washer, which I ordered a new one because the old one was corroded and not really holding on. But the point of this is to essentially lock this in from the top so that it can't fall into the engine. There we go. So like that, the governor shaft, it's locked in. If I push it or pull it, it doesn't move, but if I move it left or right, it moves without issue. Just take note, before you pull the seal out, check where it is right now as far as the depth, because you want to put the new one in the same as the old. All right, let's set this in place. We'll roughly line it up with the governor shaft paddle. And when I put the crankcase cover on, that's what holds this governor in place. But you do have to have it roughly in the right spot. So I'm actually going to tilt the engine a little bit better so that this doesn't kind of fall out of place. And once the cover goes on, it's going to lock it in right where it needs to be. Going to use a little bit of anti-seize to help the next guy out. Just putting a bit of Loctite on this bolt. It looks like it had some originally. Now, I don't know the torque spec on this bolt. It's a fine thread bolt, and this engine, it's used on lawnmowers quite a bit. Usually those blade adapters get torqued between 40 and 60 foot-pounds. So I'm going to bring this one up to 40, and I think that should be good enough. right, let's get the coil back on. I did clean up right here where it makes contact. You need a clean, good connection in order for there to be good spark. So we'll get the kill wire plugged back in. And this coil is labeled. It says right there, this side out. So make sure you do that, or else you're not going to have spark. Or if you do have spark, it's going to be weak, and the spark timing is going to be off. And to gap the coil, just use a business card to set a gap of approximately 0.010 of an inch. Right now the magnet's under there, so if I loosen up these bolts, the magnet's going to pull the coil in, and that's going to provide the perfect gap. And then rotate the engine at least once around. Make sure the coil does not make contact with the flywheel. And in this case, we're good. All right, let's get this governor fully back together. So I've removed that temporary spring, and I've put the governor rod back on. So now it's attached to the arm, which we can drop on to the shaft. Like that. That's idle. That's full throttle. So in that position, that should turn counterclockwise. So we'll just turn it until it stops, which is right there. And being sure that it stays in that position, we just need to tighten up the arm while holding it in the wide open throttle position. All right, that feels pretty good. So theoretically, the governor system is fixed, but we can test it before starting the engine. To do that, I'm going to pull the spark plug so there's no compression and put the brake in the off position. And then I'm going to rotate the engine with a drill clockwise. What we should see if the governor is working is that as the engine picks up speed, this arm should move toward us. Right now it's in the wide open throttle position. So I did re-add the governor spring. I'm actually going to remove that. So the only thing in play here is the force that the governor is going to exert, hopefully on that arm. All right, keep an eye on that governor arm. Going to hold the brake off and rotate the engine. Beautiful. And we're now in the idle position. So the governor seems to be fixed. Yeah, we're getting pretty close. I was just about to put oil in the engine, and then it occurred to me, this engine, it's not going to run. I actually made a mistake quite a ways back. When cleaning the gasket material off, I pulled that camshaft out to make it easier to clean, but also I wanted to keep some of that gasket debris from getting all over that cam. So when I started sanding, I thought it would be best to put the camshaft in the engine, close it up to keep the dust out. But when I put the camshaft in, I never timed it. The plan was to time it when putting the governor shaft in, and of course that took a few days to arrive. So by the time it arrived, I just threw it in and never checked the timing. So I went back to the video of me closing up this engine, And I can see clear as day, the engine's out of time. And there's only one way to fix that. I need to pull this engine back off, pull the pulley off the crank, and open this engine back up and set the timing. Get the governor out of the way. And I think you can see we are off by a tooth, which doesn't sound like a lot. But being a tooth off, likely the engine would have run, but very poorly. And if more than a tooth off, chances are it's not going to even try to run. But now we're on time. So we'll get this governor back in, get everything bolted back together, and pretend like it never happened. Looks like we're perfect. The line is right at the full mark. Let's get the fuel line back on. I did make up a new line and added a fuel shutoff, which for a gravity-fed system really is not optional. Needles do leak, sometimes very slowly, and if you're going to leave fuel in it, you want to be able to shut it off just in case it's leaking past that needle. So it looks like the line is just a little bit too long. So I'm going to cut that maybe a 1/4 inch shorter, and we should be good to go. All right, let's give it a quick try before fully getting it back together. I want to see that the governor has control, that the throttle is responsive and the engine doesn't overspeed. And I also left this protective cover off because, the last couple times I ran it, it was making a lot of noise. And initially I thought it was the engine, but I think it was just the cover. So I want to validate that and the governor. So I don't have the airbox on yet, so I will have to give it a little bit of help with some starting fluid since the primer is part of the airbox. All right, let's give this a try. Throttle is turned down. I'd say that was a pretty good test. It did start after a few pulls. The governor had full control of the engine speed. The max speed was just over 3,200 RPM, which seems pretty good. But the carb, it did have a surge in it. That surge kind of worked itself out as the engine warmed up. So I think we're going to be okay, especially once we add that airbox back on. As far as that noise, I think it's actually just this piece right here. It is a little bit sloppy inside of that tube, and it's just shaking and rattling. So there's really not a whole lot that can be done on that. So I say we get the cover back on, we get the airbox back on, we'll test the primer real quick, make sure it works, and then we'll bring it outside, see what it can do. It's kind of hard to see, but let's see if the primer works. Yep, seems to be fine. I don't think we're going to be reusing this. It's pretty bad. So I do have a new filter. It doesn't have the pre-filter though, which if you're going to be running it in dirt like that, you should have a pre-filter. Anyway, let me blow this out real quick. We'll clean it up and get the new filter in. I think this mystery piece goes right there, although it's not very tight. And honestly, I don't think it's needed in this application, but we'll keep it with the machine just in case. Well, it's making quick work of the brush. So plenty of horsepower, good control of the engine speed, but the surging, it's not really going away as the engine warms up. So I'm going to drop the bowl again real quick, go through the main jet real well, and we'll give this another go. Yeah, look at that. There is some junk in the bowl, so that for sure could have been causing a run issue. So I just dumped it out. go through that jet again, and we'll try this again. Overall, I'm pretty happy with the way this thing turned out, especially considering where we started. Someone pushed this to the end of their driveway hoping to make it disappear. And for good reason. This machine was neglected. It was left outside for years on end. And of course, the mouse caused the most damage of all with that governor shaft. So, yeah, bringing this to a shop to repair would not have been practical from a cost standpoint. The labor alone would have been more than this thing is worth. But as it turns out, it's very fixable. For $12, we got that governor system back up to 100%. A $5 can of paint and a bit of elbow grease. And this thing turned out really well. It starts first pull, the engine sounds great, and there's plenty of power to cut through this brush. So, yeah, it's doing a really good job. That said, though, it is not perfect. There is still a slight surge. I'm kind of hoping it works itself out. Potentially that carb needs to be cleaned, but I'd say more likely replaced. But for now, I think I'm done. So, I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.